In this lesson, we're going to learn how to work with 3D layers. Okay, so I want to step away from the composition that we've created so far and move over here to the composition that we imported as an Illustrator file as a composition. So you see that over here in your project panel. So go ahead and double click that, and that's going to open this up in the composition viewer. You can come over here and toggle that transparency grid off so that we can see all of those shapes. So right now, these are still just plain 2D layers, but they all have the layer name that they originally had in the Illustrator file. Now, this is not the way that you have to set up 3D layers at all. Anything can become a 3D layer, but I really just wanted to show you how these were named. If you brought them in from the Illustrator file, all of them are going to have those layer names because the Illustrator file didn't have the layers named. It was simply named layer 1, 2, 3, and so on. So how do we change these to 3D layers? We're going to be taking a look at this switch that you see right here that's located next to that mode column that we were using earlier. Now, if you feel like your timeline is getting too cramped, you can turn some of these modes off. So the same way that we got to that mode, you can just right click and say hide this, and those modes will disappear. And you can also go into those modes themselves or the columns, and turn off any of those by unchecking that check mark next to them, and that will hide those as well. So if you don't want to go into that individual list. So the way that I'm going to turn these layers into 3D layers is simply by hitting this switch right here. So much like whenever we turned on the motion blur switch, we just turn on the 3D switch. So I want to go ahead and show you what the position looks like as a 2D layer. So I'm just going to select one of these and hit the P key. And now I'm going to turn this layer to a 3D layer. So I'm just going to come over here and hit that switch. So now this is technically a 3D layer. And now we have a third value besides just those two X and Y values that we had earlier. And now what we have is a Z value. So the Z value is what is going to give us that depth. So it's going to move forward and away from us in a way that looks similar to scaling up and scaling down an image. But there are so many more things that we can use these 3D layers for besides just faking that depth. So we're going to talk about a few of those. But first I want to go ahead and turn the rest of these layers to 3D layers as well. So I'm just going to come down through here, and I can actually just click and drag while I'm in that column, and it will automatically move me down through all of those layers while it's continuously checking on that 3D switch. So now I just want to start playing with pushing these layers to different places in Z space and changing some of their rotation. So with this first one that we've created here, I want to move this one a little bit more forward. So all I'm doing is hovering over that Z axis. So you see that my cursor gets that little Z down in the lower right hand corner. So I know I'm grabbing the Z handle, and I'm just pulling that towards me. And then I can reposition it simply by grabbing down here in the lower corner, and that's going to move it on the X and Y axis only, or I can simply grab the handle and it will constrain it to only move on that axis. So it's harder to move on the Z axis by simply grabbing it here in the corner. So that's something you want to keep in mind. The Z axis is probably going to be the one that you use whenever you're wanting to move it closer to you. Okay, so I'm also going to rotate this layer a little bit. So I'm going to come up here and grab my rotation tool. And that's really the same as just using the rotation down here in the menu, but I can come up here and grab the rotation tool and apply that to any one of those handles, and you'll see how it only rotates it on that axis. So I'm grabbing that Y handle and it's rotating it along the y-axis. And you'll notice that that's changing this new property that we have called orientation. So now instead of it just being called rotation, we have orientation, but we also have the X, Y, and Z rotation as well. So you see that now we have these 3 individual rotations, and then we have the overall orientation as well as that third value for our position. So I don't want this to be oriented quite so far here on that diagonal. So I'm just going to change that a little bit there. And I'm going to come over and do the same for some of these other layers. So I'm just going to come in, and on that y-axis, I'm turning them just kind of in all different directions. No real formula to exactly how I'm turning these. I just want you to be able to see what is happening here. Now I'm going to grab my selection tool again before I finish all of those and show you what begins to happen as I'm pushing these back in Z space. Now you remember before, whenever I was pushing this layer back and forward in Z space, it looked like it was coming either perfectly straight or perfectly away from me as it was moving. Now if I move this, it almost looks like it's moving towards the side, and that's simply because it's moving directly back in Z space based on that orientation that we added to the Y handle. So now it's moving backwards in Z space, but at a little bit of an angle. So you want to keep that in mind before you start changing up all those orientations. Sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to move things if you haven't, or if you already have started changing around that orientation. So this layer, for instance, I'm simply going to move forward before I change any of that orientation, just to make it a little bit easier on myself. And this one as well, I haven't changed any of the orientation property yet, so it's easier for me to move backwards. Okay, so I want to do just a little bit more of this, just changing up some of those Z positions by grabbing that handle and pushing them back. And you can really do this as much as you want. I just want to get some variation. And now let's come in here and change that Y handle just a little bit more for those 2 that we hadn't changed yet. And so now we have all of our layers at different positions in Z space, as well as different rotations on their Y axes. So in this lesson, we learned how to make a regular layer into a 3D layer and change the rotation on the different axes.